In the icy stillness of Jackson Valley, a man in a tailored coat pushed his daughter's wheelchair to the cliff's edge and didn't stop. But as her scream vanished into the canyon, one creature had seen it all. Bandit, a wild Mustang with eyes full of fire, wasn't just a horse. He was her guardian, her witness, and the only one who refused to let evil win. What he did next turned a cruel man's secret into a town's miracle. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The morning sun rose slowly over Jackson Valley, Wyoming, casting pale gold light across the snow-laced meadows and distant silhouettes of the Bridger-Teton Range. A soft hush lay over the land, broken only by the whistle of winter wind rustling through pine needles and dry grass. Frost clung to fence posts and to the whiskers of the lone white Mustang that stood quietly at the edge of the Vale estate. A horse named Bandit, whose stillness belied the storm that would soon come. Gregory Vale stood beside a polished black SUV, adjusting the collar of his navy wool coat. At 51, Gregory was the kind of man who moved through life with a precision forged by decades of money, power, and detachment. His neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard framed a face built more for negotiation than empathy. His eyes, a shade of steel gray, seldom wavered or blinked unless calculating gain. In the business circles of Jackson Hole and beyond, he was known as a real estate magnate, the architect of luxury lodges and winter resorts. But behind the designer suits and cold charm was a man hardened by loss, betrayal, and above all, a deep resentment he never named aloud. In the back seat of the SUV, strapped gently into a custom wheelchair, sat his daughter, Emery Vale. 6 years old, with warm amber eyes and auburn curls tucked behind her ears, Emery was small for her age, with a quiet, radiant resilience. She had inherited her mother's tenderness and her father's fire, though only the former had ever been nurtured. Born with a spinal defect that left her legs paralyzed from the hips down, Emery had learned early to make her world brighter with stories and song. She painted skies in her imagination and whispered to the wind as if it were her playmate. Her world had shrunk since her mother died, but there was one companion who never left her side: Bandit. Bandit was unlike any horse on the estate. At 7 years old, he stood taller than most wild Mustangs, with a snow-white coat flecked with specks of gray on his flanks and a mane that danced like fire when the wind caught it. He had been untamable when first brought to the Vale stables, a rescue from a Wyoming roundup, but Emery, barely 3 at the time, had walked, or rather wheeled, into his stall and simply placed her small palm against his muzzle. Since that moment, he had followed her like a shadow with a heartbeat. No rider but her. No handler but her whisper. This morning, Bandit stood just beyond the fence, watching the SUV as it rolled slowly up the gravel path toward the hills. Something was wrong. The girl hadn't come to feed him apples or sing to him by the stable doors. His ears twitched at every sound, and his hooves stamped nervously against the frosted earth. From the bluff, a quiet ache was beginning to creep into the sky. "Daddy, where are we going?" Emery asked softly, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. Gregory did not answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the path ahead, a winding stretch of dirt and snow that led to the overlook, one of the highest ridges on their land. The silence stretched long enough for Emery's fingers to tighten around the armrest of her chair. "I thought you'd like to see the sunrise from a new spot," he finally said, his voice clipped, as though reading from a script. Emery nodded, though her heart fluttered uneasily. The wind up here felt different, harsher, like it wanted to speak but dared not. Her pink cardigan, hand-knitted by the maid who used to care for her before Regina came, billowed slightly. She pulled it tighter. Gregory parked near the edge of the bluff. He stepped out quickly and moved to unload her chair from the back. As always, he was efficient, mechanical. He unstrapped her gently, but without warmth, and rolled her toward the cliffside, the wheels crunching softly over gravel and ice. "I don't like heights," Emery whispered. Her voice cracked slightly, but she smiled, because Emery always smiled, even when she was afraid. "We won't be long," he said. Bandit, still in the valley below, had begun to pace. From the hill, the mare could sense the fear carried on the air, fear not born of terrain or temperature, but of betrayal. Gregory stopped her wheelchair mere inches from the edge. The world beyond was beautiful. A valley dusted with snow, trees dressed in winter's hush, and mountains that kissed the sky. But to Emery, it suddenly felt like the end of something. "Daddy?" Her voice trembled now. "Why are we here?" He did not answer her, not right away. Then came the voice he had never used with her before. Sharp, cold, final. "You're a burden I can't carry anymore." Her small body flinched, her eyes wide. "Regina was right," he continued, almost absently. "She said no man can build an empire with a broken child chained to his name." And just like that, he let go. The world tilted. The wheels hit the edge, and she screamed. It was not a long fall. Not yet. Her chair clipped the edge of a narrow outcrop, branches and sharp rocks jabbing at its frame. Emery dangled, strapped in, suspended, alive by pure chance and twisted metal. Her breath came in gasps, her tears freezing instantly on her cheeks. Above, Gregory turned and walked back to the SUV without a backward glance. He did not notice the white Mustang charging toward the ridge at a speed that kicked up flurries. He did not hear the shrill neigh echoing off the canyon walls, and he did not care. But Bandit did. He saw the girl. He saw her terror, and his cry shook the valley. By the time the sun had fully risen over the distant ridges of Jackson Valley, the frost had begun to melt along the edges of the wooden fences, dripping silently onto the frozen earth. The Vale Ranch, sprawled over several hundred acres of highland pasture and pine-shaded groves, was beginning to stir. Horses shuffled in their stalls, a tractor rumbled to life near the hay barn, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the foreman's cottage. But something felt off. Something small, yet loud in its absence. Leo Hargrove stood outside the stables, with a weathered hand wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. At 58, Leo was the kind of man who lived by the seasons. Stocky, with a wide chest and powerful arms built from decades of wrangling horses and lifting feed, his face carried the hard lines of sun and work and Wyoming winters. His silver-streaked hair was always tucked under a faded green ball cap, and his voice, when he spoke, had a calm, unhurried timbre that animals trusted more than people. Leo had worked the Val land since Gregory's father ran the estate, and while he had little tolerance for the businessman's aloofness, he'd always adored the girl. Emery was light in a house that grew darker by the day. That morning, Bandit had not come to the gate like he always did for breakfast. The Mustang was pacing in the corner of his paddock, his nostrils flared, ears twitching toward the hills. His white coat, now dulled by dust and dampness, shivered despite the waning cold. Leo approached slowly, narrowing his eyes. "Morning, boy," he muttered, clicking his tongue. "You look like you've seen ghosts." Bandit neighed, tossing his head, his gaze fixed on the mountain trail that snaked into the evergreens. Leo followed the horse's line of sight, heart knocking once in warning. Something wasn't right. At the edge of the stall, caught in the weathered wood of the gate latch, was a small pink ribbon, creased and slightly dirtied. Leo's breath caught. It was the kind of ribbon Emery wore every day, tied carefully at the base of her curls by her own small hands or sometimes by Nora's. Leo picked it up slowly, brushing the dust from the silk. Then, instinct born from years of ranch work and gut feeling gripped his spine. He turned and hurried back toward the cottage. Inside, Nora Hargrove was humming gently as she set a pan of cinnamon biscuits into the oven. A plump woman in her early 50s with honey blonde hair always tied into a neat bun, Nora had warm hazel eyes and a smile that reached everyone. She had worked in the Vale household as a cook and housekeeper before Gregory's marriage to Regina. When Regina arrived with her minimalist tastes and sharp tongue, Nora had been subtly dismissed from the main house and now focused solely on caring for the ranch staff and helping Leo manage the animals. Still, she missed the girl. Missed the mornings when Emery would roll her chair up to the porch and ask about how biscuits rise or why cows chewed twice. "Have you seen Emery?" Leo asked without preamble. Nora looked up, blinking. "Not today. She didn't come by before breakfast." "She always comes," Leo said quietly, placing the ribbon on the table. Nora's smile faded. She wiped her hands on her apron and came closer, examining the ribbon. "Where did you find this?" "On the stall gate. Bandit's been anxious as hell all morning. Something's not right." They both stood silent for a moment, the gravity between them settling like a weight neither wanted to acknowledge. "I saw Gregory's SUV head out early," Leo continued. "Alone, came back not long ago, looking off, coat all dusty like he'd been walking, but no sign of Emery. Maybe he took her somewhere, Nora offered, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe, Leo murmured, but not without telling anyone, not without her chair left behind. He didn't say what he really thought, that the girl was missing, that the man who'd brought her into the world might not be who they always pretended he was. Across the ranch, a small red pickup truck rattled down the drive. It came to a slow stop near the stable, and a tall woman stepped out, brushing dust off her jeans. Sheriff's Deputy Maggie Thorne, 33, had the kind of no-nonsense energy that turned heads without ever demanding attention. With high cheekbones, short chestnut hair tucked behind one ear, and an ever-present utility belt, Maggie had grown up in the valley, raised by a single father who ran the local feed store. Known for her sharp intuition and protective instincts, Maggie had once been Emery's riding companion during equine therapy sessions. She had a soft spot for the child that never faded, even as her badge led her to more hardened responsibilities. "I heard from the feed store that Bandit's been out of sorts," she said, climbing out of the truck with a brow raised. "Figured I'd stop by." Leo handed her the ribbon. "We think Emery might be missing." Maggie's face stilled. "Tell me everything." Together they walked toward the paddock where Bandit had started to circle tighter, agitated. Maggie knelt near the hoofprints, her eyes scanning the frozen dirt, picking out impressions most wouldn't see, tracks from a wheelchair, deep and sharp, leading toward the trail, but no sign of return. "She didn't come back," Maggie whispered. From the main house, a distant shape moved past the window. Gregory Vale, dressed in a fresh suit, adjusted his cuffs as he passed. He paused only briefly before drawing the curtains closed. The wind over Jackson Valley grew sharper as the morning advanced, picking up speed as it threaded through the lodge poles and the switchgrass. Clouds were beginning to mass low over the Tetons, trailing shadows across the land like silent hunters. In the paddock, Bandit reared slightly, his powerful muscles straining against the post Leo had tied him to. The white Mustang's breath came fast, pluming like steam in the cold, his eyes wide with urgency, fixed on the path that led toward the mountains. Leo Hargrove had seen horses panic before, spooked by thunder, by cougars, even by the smell of a storm. But this wasn't panic, it was purpose. Bandit wasn't running from something, he was trying to go somewhere. "I don't like it," Leo muttered, reaching for the lead rope. Maggie Thorne stood a few feet behind him, arms crossed against the rising wind. She was scanning the trail with narrowed eyes, her jaw set. "If there's a trail to follow, we've got to start now, before it gets covered. That storm's moving in fast." Leo didn't hesitate. He untied Bandit and looked him square in the eye. "All right, boy, show me." Bandit whinnied and turned immediately, trotting off down the worn gravel trail that curved behind the barn and headed uphill. Leo followed on foot, his boots crunching with every step, his breath already short from the incline. Maggie fell in behind him, her radio clipped to her shoulder and a flashlight swinging from her belt, just in case. They passed the lower meadow where the ranch's younger foals grazed and continued toward the pine line. Bandit's pace was deliberate, his head turning every so often to make sure they followed. It was like he knew something that needed no words. As the trail narrowed, Maggie paused and knelt beside a patch of ground where snow had melted slightly under the morning sun. There, barely visible but unmistakable, were two deep impressions, the kind left by wheelchair tires. Leo knelt beside her, squinting. "She was here," he said. "This is fresh." They continued on. The sky began to shift, light turning silver gray and the temperature falling slightly. Maggie radioed into the dispatch center, speaking quickly but firmly, requesting a drone search if the storm allowed, and notifying Sheriff Brody of a potential missing child case in active progress. Further up the ridge, Bandit stopped abruptly near a break in the brush. The trees gave way to a narrow, crumbling overlook. The wind here was stronger, pushing against them like an invisible hand. Leo stepped forward. His eyes scanned the ground, and his gut turned cold. The dirt near the cliff was torn up in a chaotic spray, deep grooves from wheels that had skidded, the faint drag marks of something heavy being pulled or falling. His breath caught in his chest. "Here," he said hoarsely. "She went off here." Maggie followed the line of his finger, then stepped carefully to the edge, her heart hammering. She pulled a small pair of binoculars from her jacket. For a moment, there was nothing but rock and wind. Then she saw it. About 30 feet down, clinging to a jagged outcrop, was a flash of pink. A small form, twisted in a chair caught by a tangle of dead branches and stone. "Dear God," she whispered. From somewhere below, faint and distant, a child's voice rose against the howl of the wind. "Uncle Leo." Leo staggered back from the edge. His knees almost gave way, but he braced himself against a tree trunk, his hand gripping bark until his knuckles went white. "We need help," Maggie said firmly, already turning to head back. "We need gear, rope, someone who can rappel." Leo nodded, still dazed. Then something in him hardened. "I know who to call." 3 miles east on the edge of the valley lived a man named Dylan Knox. Tall, lean, and weather-worn, Dylan was a former climbing instructor who now worked seasonal contracts as a backcountry rescue consultant. At 39, his tanned face was partially hidden beneath a scruff of beard, and his green eyes were the kind that had stared into death enough times to learn not to flinch. Once an elite mountaineer, Dylan had vanished from the public eye after a fall in the Rockies cost the life of his closest friend and nearly crippled him. He walked with a slight limp and didn't talk much, but when you needed someone to face a cliff without blinking, he was your man. When Leo and Maggie pulled into his driveway in the red pickup, Dylan was repairing a weatherproof tarp outside his cabin. He didn't even ask questions. One look at Leo's face and he was already reaching for his gear bag. "Who's the kid?" he asked quietly as he slung a coil of rope over one shoulder. "Her name's Emery Vale," Maggie answered. "She's 6, wheelchair-bound, and she's hanging on a ledge." Dylan's jaw tensed. "Then we don't have time." Back at the ranch, Bandit stood at the edge of the bluff, refusing to budge. Leo had tried to lead him back once, gently tugging his halter, but the horse planted his hooves and wouldn't move. It was as if he knew that the girl he loved was still down there. Maggie gave him a soft pat before slipping back toward the trail. "Stay with her," she whispered. As Dylan, Leo, and Maggie returned with harnesses and ropes, the first drops of snow began to fall, light, stinging, like tiny warnings. Dylan worked quickly, testing anchors, checking knots, looping gear through his belt like a man born to do just this. His calm energy settled everyone. "I'll go down," Dylan said, already clipping in. "Leo, you stay at the top and manage the lines. Maggie, spot and radio in if you see movement." Leo placed a hand on Dylan's shoulder. "Bring her back, son." Dylan nodded once and disappeared over the edge, his boots finding holds like instinct. Bandit let out a low, mournful sound that cut through the wind. 30 feet below, Emery Vale waited. Snow began falling in earnest as Dylan Knox descended the cliff. Each flake clung to his jacket, already heavy with moisture. The granite face was slick beneath his boots, the rope shifting slightly with every movement. He moved with the precision of someone who had danced with mountains for years, controlled, deliberate, and absolutely focused. Above him, Leo Hargrove stood anchored with gloved hands bracing the main line, his breath steaming as it met the cold. Maggie Thorne knelt a few feet away, radio in hand, giving updates to dispatch in short, clipped bursts. And next to her, motionless as a statue carved from snow, Bandit remained. The Mustang had refused food, water, even comfort since they had arrived. His focus was absolute, ears perked, tail still, eyes never leaving the cliff's edge. It was more than loyalty. It was connection. Below, Emery Vale sat twisted in her wheelchair, nestled precariously between jagged rocks and brittle branches. The metal frame groaned with each gust of wind, a grim symphony against the silence of her breathing. The straps that held her in place were frayed. Her pink cardigan was soaked, the knitted sleeves clinging to her arms. Her auburn curls stuck to her face, wet with melted snow and tears that had long gone quiet. Emery was cold, colder than she had ever been. But not afraid. Not anymore. Because above her, like a shadow waiting to catch the sun, she knew Bandit was there. And because somewhere in the storm, she thought she could still hear her mother's voice. Her mother, Catherine Vale, had died 2 years earlier, but her presence still lingered like lavender on an old sweater. Catherine had been a striking woman, tall and graceful, with ocean blue eyes and a voice that could hush even the angriest storm. She had been a gentle soul, a teacher by profession, a mother by nature. Her kindness had softened even Gregory once, back in a time when love hadn't yet been replaced by ambition. After her death, Emery had begun whispering her mother's bedtime stories to the walls, to her dolls, and especially to Bandit. They were stories of invisible wings, of stars that never left, and of girls who could do anything, even if they couldn't walk. Now, with her fingers numb and her breath shaky, Emery began to hum a lullaby Catherine used to sing, barely audible over the wind. "Sleep now, little sparrow," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The sky still holds you near." Above, Dylan spotted her. "Emery," he called gently, voice rising over the wind. Her eyes fluttered open and she blinked toward the sound. "Are you a real person?" she asked faintly. Dylan chuckled softly, lowering himself the final few feet. "Depends on your definition. But yes, I'm very real, and I'm here to bring you home." She nodded, her lips bluish. "Bandit said you'd come." Dylan paused just long enough to glance up at the white silhouette on the ridge. Then he unstrapped his harness, secured an anchor point on a large outcrop, and crawled toward her. He worked fast, assessing the chair. "It's wedged tight," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Too risky to lift her with it. We'll need to do a vertical extraction, separate the girl from the frame." "Will it hurt?" Emery asked, her voice no louder than snowfall. "Only for a second," Dylan replied, kneeling beside her, "but I promise I won't let go." Back at the top, the storm was beginning to intensify. Wind whipped Maggie's scarf free, and she caught it with one hand, eyes narrowing at the sky. "We've got 20 minutes, maybe less," she said into her radio. "Then the ridge will ice." Leo's jaw was clenched. He'll make it. Inside his chest, the old rancher was fighting something harder than wind: guilt. He had always suspected that Gregory's heart was more polished than pure, but he never thought it would come to this. He had trusted that a father's instinct would override cruelty, that somewhere in Gregory's chest still lived the man Catherine had once loved. Now, watching the storm roll in, he realized how wrong he'd been. Dylan looped a second harness around Emery's small frame, securing the straps beneath her arms and across her waist. He tested every knot twice, then once more for luck. The girl was shivering now, but awake, her eyes locked on his with the quiet trust only children possess. "I'm ready," she whispered. "Hold tight," Dylan replied. He radioed the signal. Above, Leo and Maggie began the slow, measured pull. Snow fell thicker now, erasing outlines and softening sound. The rope strained under the dual weight, the wind trying to rock the line. Bandit let out a sudden neigh, a sound sharp as thunder, and for a moment it felt like the storm paused to listen. Bit by bit, Dylan and Emery rose. Inside the Vale mansion, a different storm brewed. Fiona Vale, Gregory's new wife, stood by the parlor window sipping tea. In her late 30s, Fiona was tall, sleek, and angular. Her fashion was minimalist, her personality even more so. Raised in New York society, she had married Gregory not for warmth but for inheritance, seeking security and status with the clinical ambition of a business merger. She had never hidden her discomfort around Emery. "She's a burden, Gregory," she had once said over wine. "An echo of someone you used to be. You're not that man anymore." Now, as she watched snow swirl outside, she paced. Gregory had not spoken much since returning from the mountains. He had gone to his study and locked the door. Something was unraveling, and she could feel it. At the ridge, Dylan and Emery emerged over the edge. Leo dropped to his knees beside them. "Baby girl?" he gasped. She smiled weakly. "Hi, Uncle Leo." Bandit stepped forward, pressing his muzzle to her cheek. Emery wrapped a trembling hand around the horse's mane. "Told you he'd come," she murmured. The snowstorm that had threatened to choke the valley finally began to retreat, leaving behind a silvery hush over the land. In the dimming light, the Vale mansion stood like a sleeping giant, its tall windows fogged with condensation, hiding the secrets it had held too long. Inside, the hearth in the main parlor crackled faintly, but no warmth reached the corners of the house where truth had started to creep in like smoke beneath a locked door. Nora Hargrove moved with quiet intent through the servants' corridor. Though no longer employed in the main house since Fiona Vale's arrival, she still knew every creaking floorboard and every panel that shifted under pressure. Short and broad-shouldered, Nora had once been the soft soul of the estate, with strong arms, an ever-warm apron, and a laugh that could chase away winter blues. But 2 years under the icy indifference of Gregory's second wife had stripped her from the warmth of the dining room and relegated her to the ranch side of the property. She had returned to the house that afternoon to retrieve an old first aid kit from the storage closet, a precaution in case Dylan's rescue effort brought back more than cold. She didn't expect to hear voices through the cracked door of the library. At first, it was muffled. But then a name reached her ears. Emery. Nora froze, leaning close. Inside, Gregory's voice was low and agitated. "You don't understand, Fiona. This changes everything." Fiona, crisp and cold as glass, answered, "What I understand is that your daughter should have been declared under treatment 3 hours ago. If the documents aren't filed soon, someone will notice. I destroyed the originals," Gregory muttered, "but the hospital database needs to be scrubbed." "And what about the birthright?" Fiona snapped. "Her inheritance is locked in a trust. No access until she turns 18 unless she's declared incapacitated." Nora's hand flew to her mouth. Inside, Gregory sighed. "I've already spoken to the lawyer. We delay the declaration of death, say she was sent to a facility for intensive therapy. After a few weeks, we announce she didn't make it." "And if someone asks why there's no record," Fiona asked coolly, "we'll say it was private. You know how wealthy families handle these things." Nora didn't hear the rest. She had backed away in horror, barely keeping her composure as she slipped from the corridor and exited through the mudroom door. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number she hadn't used in years. "Sheriff's office," came the gruff voice. "Brody," she whispered. "It's Nora Hargrove. I need to report something. It's about Gregory Vale and Emery." At the sheriff's office, Sheriff Hank Brody stood by the window watching the snow settle on the street lamp outside. In his late 60s, Hank had the broad frame of a man who once played high school football and never gave up that posture. His dark hair had thinned into gray patches at the temples, and his brown eyes carried the weight of every hard truth Jackson Valley had whispered over the decades. He was slow to anger, but even slower to forgive injustice. After a long career, he could smell deceit before it knocked on his door. He placed the receiver back in the cradle and turned toward his deputy. "Call Judge Myers," he said. "We're going to need a warrant." Back at the cliffside, Dylan had just finished lifting Emery over the edge, and Maggie was wrapping the girl in a heavy wool blanket as Leo called in the successful recovery. Bandit pressed his head gently against the girl's cheek, and she giggled faintly, the sound fragile but real. "Let's get her warm," Maggie said, "and then to the clinic." Leo loaded the girl gently into the back of the red pickup, nestling her against hot packs and blankets. Bandit followed beside the vehicle, his hooves leaving prints alongside the tires. Meanwhile, inside Gregory's private study, the man himself was scrambling. Stacks of papers littered his mahogany desk: wills, medical forms, therapy documents, and a carefully forged record of an out-of-state medical transfer that had never occurred. The fireplace crackled, swallowing another shredded page as he poured a splash of scotch into his tumbler. His hand trembled slightly. He had believed Emery was gone. He had convinced himself it was mercy. But something in Fiona's gaze had chilled even him. She wasn't panicking, she was planning, calculating what would happen next. He looked up sharply as she entered the study. "Well?" she asked. He said nothing, just drained his glass. Then came the sirens, first faint, like a distant wind, then louder. Fiona stiffened. "No," she whispered. At the front door, Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies stood ready. Snow still clung to their jackets as they knocked with authority. Fiona opened the door, her face schooled into a polite confusion. "Officers? Where's Gregory Vale?" Brody asked, his voice like gravel. She stepped back silently. The sheriff entered. Gregory was waiting in the study, fire now out, hands folded. "I assume this is about the girl." "We'll talk at the station," Brody said, stepping forward to clasp the cuffs on his wrists. Gregory didn't resist. Upstairs, Nora, now safe with the officers who had escorted her back, watched from a landing, heart pounding with both sorrow and vindication. As Gregory was led to the cruiser, Bandit neighed from the pasture beyond. Emery, now safe inside the Hargroves ranch house, lay nestled in bed, eyes wide, but no longer afraid. She whispered to Leo, "I think Daddy made a terrible mistake." Leo nodded, smoothing her hair. "But you're going to be okay now, sweetheart. That part's over." Outside, the wind had finally calmed, and for the first time in days, the stars were beginning to emerge from behind the clouds. By the time the sky cleared and the last echoes of sirens faded into the snowy hills of Jackson Valley, The cliff was quiet again, save for the rhythmic crunch of Dylan Knox's boots returning to solid ground. The tension that had held everyone in a breathless grip finally began to ease as Emery Vale, swaddled in wool and trembling with fatigue, lay safe in the back of the pickup truck. She was pale and scraped but alive, her cheeks glowing faintly with returning color. A few feet away, Bandit stood with his head low, flanks quivering from the cold. Snow clung to the long white strands of his mane and tail, now frozen into ribbons by wind and ice. The Mustang was silent, but his presence was louder than any siren. He hadn't left the cliff's edge once since Emery vanished from view, and now that she had returned, he pressed himself gently against the tailgate, eyes fixed on the bundle that was her. Maggie Thorne approached with a blanket, draping it across Bandit's shoulders. "You've done more than most men would," she whispered. The horse blinked slowly, as if understanding. Inside the truck, Emery turned her head toward the window, squinting through the glass. "Is he still there?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Leo leaned in. "Right by your side, kiddo?" "Then I'm okay," she said softly, and let herself drift into sleep. At the town's small medical clinic, the night shift nurse looked up in alarm as the red pickup came to a stop under the emergency canopy. Her name was Georgia Weller, a woman in her early 40s with soft brown skin, a round face, and the kind of warm voice that made children instinctively reach for her hand. Having worked in trauma care during a stint with Doctors Without Borders, she was no stranger to critical cases. But she hadn't expected the one they wheeled in on that snowy evening. "Vitals are weak but stable," Maggie informed her. 6 years old, wheelchair-bound, exposed overnight on a cliff face. "She's a miracle." Georgia nodded and guided the stretcher into the brightly lit hallway where another nurse prepped a private room. The warmth hit Emery's face like a sigh. Her fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. Meanwhile, outside, Bandit tried to follow. It took 2 orderlies and Leo to coax him back from the sliding glass doors. He neighed loudly once, twice, until Georgia herself stepped outside. She looked at the horse, then back toward the room where Emery had been taken. "Let him stay," she said firmly. "She needs him more than we need policy." News traveled fast in Jackson Valley. By morning, the entire town had heard. Emery Vale was alive, rescued from a death trap no one had known existed. That she'd survived a night in sub-zero temperatures strapped to a broken chair halfway down a cliff, that a wild horse had guarded her like a soldier with a sacred vow, and that her father, Gregory Vale, was now in custody, charged with endangerment, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The local paper, the Jackson Valley Echo, ran the headline, "Mustang Saves Little Girl. Father Arrested in Shocking Betrayal." Sheriff Hank Brody stood before a crowd of reporters outside the sheriff's office later that morning. With his usual no-frills delivery, he confirmed the charges, commended the rescue team, and promised full transparency. "This is a community that takes care of its own," he said, "and we will see justice done." Inside the sheriff's office, Fiona Vale sat on a bench near the holding cells, her arms folded across her designer coat. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was damp with snowmelt, and her heels, more suited for city sidewalks than county jail, clicked nervously on the tile. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she muttered, mostly to herself. "You're right about that," came the voice of Nora Hargrove, stepping in from the hallway with a cup of tea in hand. "But it did, and maybe it should have." Back at the clinic, Emery stirred in her bed. A portable IV hung beside her, and heat from a ceramic lamp warmed the room. Her eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she saw was the long white face of Bandit, pressed against the outside of the window. She smiled. Leo entered with a tray of warm oatmeal and a pink thermos of cocoa. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said. "Did Bandit really stay all night?" she asked. "He hasn't left once," Leo replied. "Georgia let him stay by the window. I think she's a horse whisperer in disguise." "I had a dream," Emery whispered, staring at Bandit. "That mommy came to me. She said, 'Not yet,' and then I heard Bandit's voice calling me back." Leo sat down beside her, careful not to jostle the wires or blankets. "You're one tough little girl, you know that?" Emery looked serious. "I think I had help." Later that afternoon, Dr. Helen Ramsey arrived to check on her patient. In her late 50s, Dr. Ramsey was tall, lean, and always smelled faintly of eucalyptus and ink. She had a reputation for being direct but compassionate, and her long years of pediatric care had taught her to listen as much as she diagnosed. She reviewed the charts, checked the bruising on Emery's arms, and asked a few quiet questions. "Any dizziness? Nausea?" "No," Emery replied. "Just tired." "That's your body healing," the doctor said with a small smile. "And from what I hear, you've got the best medicine waiting outside that window." When she stepped back into the hallway, Dr. Ramsey pulled Georgia aside. "We'll run a scan tomorrow, but for now, it's rest and support." Georgia nodded. "And the horse?" "Let him stay," the doctor said. "At this point, he's part of her treatment plan." That night, snow fell again, gentler this time, like a blanket rather than a warning. Emery slept soundly under her quilt, one hand resting on a stuffed animal someone had brought from the gift box downstairs. Bandit stood outside her window, now wrapped in a donated thermal blanket. Every few minutes, he shifted his weight but never wandered. In the stillness of the room, with monitors blinking and winter humming outside, it felt, if only for a moment, like the world had righted itself. The courtroom in Jackson Valley's Old Town Hall hadn't seen this many people in years. Built from local stone and hardwood nearly a century ago, it had the dignity of history in every beam and bench. That morning, though, it wasn't the architecture drawing attention. It was a 6-year-old girl in a soft blue dress, seated in a custom wheelchair, flanked by the two people who had become her compass in a world upended, Leo and Nora Hargrove. The gallery was filled with locals, ranchers, teachers, shopkeepers, many of whom had watched Emery grow up from behind counters or across stable fences. There was a hush as Judge Eleanor Thompson entered. In her late 60s, Judge Thompson was known for her integrity and poise, a woman of sharp intellect and a heart guarded like a fortress. With cropped silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, she radiated an authority that needed no raising of the voice. But beneath the bench's formality was a grandmother of 7 and a lifelong believer that justice should not only be served, but felt. Gregory Vale sat at the defense table, hands folded tightly, face hollow with sleeplessness. Gone was the tailored suit and self-assured posture. In its place, a man unraveling. Fiona Vale sat 2 seats down, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, makeup smudged, eyes red. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her blazer, a rare show of nerves for a woman who once demanded silence with a glance. "Miss Emery Vale," Judge Thompson said gently, "do you feel ready to speak?" Emery nodded, her amber eyes shining not with fear, but resolve. Georgia Weller, who had accompanied her from the clinic that morning, stood nearby as emotional support. Bandit was not in the courtroom, but the child wore a small silver charm around her neck, a pendant in the shape of a galloping horse. Emery's voice, though soft, carried. "My daddy took me to the mountains," she began. "He said we were going to watch the sunrise, but when we got to the edge, he pushed me." A hush fell over the room. Someone in the gallery gasped. Emery continued, eyes steady. "I thought I was going to die, but Bandit stayed, and Uncle Leo and Miss Maggie came, and Mr. Dillon saved me." "Did your father say anything to you before he pushed?" the prosecutor asked. Emery hesitated. "He said I was a burden. He said that Regina didn't want me, that he couldn't carry me anymore." Gregory flinched. Fiona looked down at her hands. Judge Thompson leaned forward slightly. "Thank you, Emery. You are very brave." The courtroom turned next to Fiona Vale. Her attorney, a young woman from Cheyenne named Lydia Barnes, tall and dark-haired with a stern demeanor, had pleaded for leniency, but Fiona had asked to speak for herself. "I didn't think he would actually do it," Fiona whispered, voice cracking. "I told him the inheritance was locked, that Emery would always be a complication, but I never said to." She broke off sobbing. "I thought he would send her away, not try to kill her." "She is a child," Judge Thompson replied, her voice unshaking. "Not a transaction." Testimony ended before noon. Judge Thompson recessed for 20 minutes. When she returned, the room stilled. "This court," she said, "recognizes the following: that Gregory Vale is guilty of attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. That Fiona Vale is complicit in the concealment of intent and knowingly engaged in discussions to remove legal rights from a minor. This court transfers all financial and property holdings to a protected trust fund in the name of Emery Vale. The trust will be managed by the court until her 18th birthday. Furthermore, this court authorizes the permanent revocation of Gregory Vale's parental rights." Gasps, murmurs. Emery's eyes widened, then filled with tears. In light of their actions, the judge continued, this court also grants full custody and guardianship of Emery Vale to Leo and Nora Hargrove, who have demonstrated unwavering care and commitment to her welfare. Nora's hands flew to her mouth. Leo gripped Emery's shoulder gently, a silent vow made flesh. As for Bandit, Judge Thompson added with a faint smile, this court recognizes the extraordinary role he played in Emery's survival and emotional recovery. As such, he is hereby designated an official emotional support animal and companion, with all rights and protections afforded under Wyoming state law. A cheer broke out, brief but heartfelt. Even Judge Thompson didn't stop it. Later that day, as they exited the courthouse, Emery was lifted gently into a newly modified van. The side doors had been adapted by local volunteers, and a custom ramp allowed her easy access. Bandit stood at the curb, his coat groomed and his halter tied loosely. A garland of winter berries had been braided into his mane by a group of schoolchildren earlier that morning. At the far end of the sidewalk, Sheriff Brody watched the scene unfold. He stood beside Pete Collins, the ranch neighbor and part-time climber who had helped Dylan with rescue prep. Pete, a wiry man in his 40s with sun-worn skin and a quiet way of speaking, held a thermos of coffee and shook his head. Never thought I'd see a town come together this fast, he said. Sometimes it takes a storm, Brody replied. Back at the Hargrove Ranch, preparations were already underway. The old barn had been cleaned, repainted, and renovated into a heated stable for Bandit. Volunteers from the county had come with donations, grain, hay, even a hand-carved sign that read Bandit's Watch. Inside the house, Nora had rearranged the guest room into a cozy haven. The walls were now a soft lavender, and a mural of stars and wildflowers stretched above the bed. Emery's new wheelchair, a surprise gift from a local foundation, was designed with silver accents and soft leather handles. On the windowsill facing the pasture sat a small brass bell. For when you want to call him, Leo said. That night, as the wind sighed gently through the valley, Emery fell asleep under her new quilt. One hand curled around the silver horse pendant. Outside, Bandit paced the pasture once, then lay down beneath her window, where he would stay. Silent, watchful, home. The first rays of spring sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the Hargrove Ranch house, casting golden stripes across the wooden floor of Emery's new room. The lavender-painted walls glowed softly in the morning light, dotted with hand-painted constellations Leo had carefully stenciled in a late-night effort. A dream catcher hung above the bed, swaying gently in the breeze from the open window. On the windowsill facing the east pasture sat a small brass bell, a gift from Georgia Weller, who had promised to visit once a week with warm cocoa and stories from the clinic. Emery Vale, now a few months older and visibly stronger, sat at her desk in a wheelchair, customized with soft leather grips and floral stitching. Her auburn curls were longer now, pulled into a loose braid by Nora that morning, and a gentle smile played across her lips as she arranged her newest photos. The leather-bound scrapbook lay open before her, each page chronicling the journey that had nearly ended on a cliff, but instead became the beginning of something extraordinary. The centerpiece of every page was Bandit. The white Mustang, his coat now well-brushed and glistening with health, stood just beyond the window in a newly built stall attached to the side of the house. The structure, nicknamed Bandit's Porch by the local children, had been a community project. It featured an extended overhang for shelter, padded flooring, and a wide opening that allowed Bandit to poke his head into the window of Emery's room at any hour. And he did, often. Every evening before bed, he would rest his muzzle on the windowsill and let Emery stroke his nose as she told him about her day. In return, he would nick her softly, his breath warming her fingers. That morning, however, Bandit was already saddled. Out back, beyond the barn and the now thriving vegetable garden Nora tended, a new therapeutic riding ring had been installed. White fencing bordered the soft dirt, and a team of local volunteers had laid out a smooth path for training exercises. It had become the heart of Emery's afternoons and her growing circle of friends. Dr. Helen Ramsey, who had since taken on a part-time role as a community liaison for pediatric therapy, stood near the ring holding a clipboard. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt beneath her lab coat, and her hair, usually pulled back, flowed freely in the wind. Her presence radiated steadiness, and the children adored her. Also present was Carly Simmons, a teen volunteer from the local high school. At 16, Carly was tall and slender, with honey blonde hair, braces, and a tendency to talk faster when nervous. A former shy student who had blossomed through working with horses, she now mentored younger kids and had taken a special liking to Emery. "Ready to ride?" Carly called out as she adjusted Bandit's reins. Emery wheeled up to the mounting ramp. "More than ready," she beamed. With Leo's steady hand guiding her waist, she was soon lifted into a special adaptive saddle designed for children with limited mobility. The straps were snug, and the saddle had extra padding for comfort and balance. As Bandit shifted slightly, Emery placed her hands gently on the pommel and looked to Carly. "Same course as last week?" "Nope," Carly grinned. "We added a surprise." The session began. Emery guided Bandit through a series of slow loops, weaving between painted barrels and wooden poles. The crowd of parents and volunteers, many of whom had seen the girl's story unfold in the local paper, watched with admiration and pride. A few took pictures. A few wiped away tears. As Bandit stepped over a row of cones with the grace of a dancer, Emery's laugh rang out, a clear, uninhibited sound that made more noise than any courtroom or hospital ever could. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. After the session, Emery dismounted with help and wheeled herself over to the fence where a small group of children waited to pet Bandit. Among them was Sammy Ruiz, a 7-year-old boy with autism and a deep love for animals. With curly dark hair and wide brown eyes, Sammy rarely spoke outside of his family. But today, he reached out and whispered, "Pretty horse." Emery turned to him. "His name's Bandit? Want to help me brush him later?" Sammy nodded. It was that simple. Later that evening, the Hargrove home buzzed with warmth. Nora served a stew made from vegetables harvested just that morning, while Leo strung fairy lights along the porch, preparing for a spring gathering the town was planning. Pete Collins and Sheriff Brody were expected to stop by, along with Georgia, Maggie, and even Dylan Knox. Though he still preferred the quiet of his cabin, he'd promised to bring a handcrafted horseshoe gift for Bandit. Inside, Emery worked on her scrapbook. She titled the newest page "Our First Ride Together" and placed a photo Carly had taken. Her atop Bandit, one hand raised in a mock wave, the other gripping the reins. In the corner of the page, she wrote with careful cursive, "True love always wins in the end, especially when it runs on 4 legs." She rang the brass bell once, just for him. Outside, Bandit stirred, rose, and took his place by the window. In a world where betrayal can come from those meant to protect us, and silence often hides the deepest pain, this story reminds us of a simple truth, that love, loyalty, and courage can still light the way. Emery didn't just survive because someone saved her. She survived because one horse stood firm, one man listened to his heart, and a town remembered what it meant to care. Every day, we pass by people carrying invisible burdens. We may not see the cliff they're clinging to or the hope they're about to lose. But like Bandit, we can choose to stand by them. We can be the voice that refuses to be silent, the presence that says, "I'm here," and the heart that proves real love never walks away. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on who your Bandit is, or how you might be someone else's. Then help us spread these stories of hope. Share this video, leave a comment with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove the world is still full of miracles. Sometimes on 4 legs.